Top of the morning. You right with you. Okay, I'm back with it. Peace. Let me share this joint on Facebook real quick. I always do that echo whenever I go to post this on Facebook. Did you ever notice that? It's time to get some money. I'm reading to encourage other people to read because it's the one significant thing that you can do consistently and build and grow in all areas of life. How y'all doing this morning? They say the early bird get the worm. I'm a believer in that. So this session's chapter, we're going to begin with chapter 3, Crimes Against Humanity. And as you know, we're reading out of the Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome book by Dr. Joy DeGruy. In the fall of 2004, on one of my visits to New York City, I was asked to speak to a group of incarcerated young men 16 to 18 years old. Though I had often spoke to young prisoners, I was not prepared for what awaited me this time in New York. I was going to Rikers Island. We were driven to a set of bungalows, the last stop before crossing the bridge to the prison. I watched as hundreds of cars traveled to and fro across the bridge, unaware that it led exclusively to the island of prisoners. The traffic was not different on this bridge than any of the others I had traveled during my visits to New York over the years. Non-stop movement, endless wayfarers bound to various destinations, albeit less restrictive than Rikers, but oftentimes no less dismal. One has only to look at the city's poorest neighborhoods. I cannot describe the awesome feeling of dread that began to shroud my emotions as we made our way over the bridge. A sea of barbed wire with razor sharp edges resembling the ominous rows of teeth of a great white shark stretched as far as my eyes could take in. But the predators who inhabited this island did not live in the turbulent waters that encircled what I was told was the largest penal institution in the world. These predators wore the drab uniforms of captives and no less dreary garb of armed prison guards. Pardon me. The guards had the added wardrobe accessory of weapons that seemed to come in all sizes and shapes. The only color that I can recall from my visit is gray. This gray color covered more than the buildings and the uniforms of this massive prison. It seemed to engulf the spirits of its inhabitants. As we drove, I asked one of my escorts, a school administrator, about the demographics of the prison. The prison has roughly 15,000 employees with 14,000 inmates made up of men, women, and youth, he said matter-of-factly. I got to pause there because it's a known fact that there's over like 40,000 inmates in Rikers Island. Yeah. I was stunned, but managed to ask a second question. What is the racial or ethnic makeup of the MA population? This resulted in an even more devastating reply. And again, I forgot that this book was wrote a few years ago, but I'm saying I haven't been in prison, y'all, in like 12, 13, 14 years, something like that, right? But I distinctly remember it being overcrowded and people coming up missing and dying and stuff like that. Like they planning on shutting Rikers down. And I wanted to say it was supposed to hold like 25,000, but it was almost double its capacity, not like 2 years ago. Okay. This resulted in an even more devastating reply. Oh, I was stunned, but managed to ask the second question. What is the racial or ethnic makeup of the MA population? We already know that. This resulted in an even more devastating reply. He hesitated a bit before answering, as if he bore some personal shame associated with his response. The MA population is 85% African American. I was so staggered, I didn't even hear who comprised the remaining 15%. I became numb, hearing only my own heart beating in my ears. I wondered how many Americans were aware of this island penitentiary that housed multitude of nameless black people. And if people were aware, why was there no public outrage? If you haven't seen the story of Kalief Browder, I strongly urge you to go watch it. If you feel that the Central Park 5 moved you, go and see what's happening on a daily basis to black women and men and children. Check out Kalief Browder. It's on Netflix. Here, the word overrepresentation is the grossest of understatements that fails to account for so blatant a wrong. Yet this unspeakable crime has been committed in the plain sight of us all and required our collective will in order to be perpetrated. I thought if Americans could ignore a tenth of Rwanda's inhabitants being slaughtered and millions of others dislocated, why should these thousands of black men, women, and youth warrant any Americans' notice? After all, they're criminals and we are just protecting the common good. When we arrived at our destination, I was taken to a large room, which they referred to as the chapel, though it lacked any similarity to a traditional religious hall except for the rows of pews. There, 150 young men were seated neatly separated into four sections with armed guards surrounding the room. I stood on a slightly raised platform with a large podium. Consistent with the prison's demographics, I looked out into a sea of nearly all black faces. I began by telling them who I was and why I was there. I shared that one of my missions was to help prevent young African American males from ever entering correctional institutions. I went on to say that another of my desires was to ensure that those in the audience would never return to Rikers. Mostly, I talked about post traumatic slave syndrome and how young men were being socialized in prisons and, like homing pigeons, being conditioned to return. At first, I sensed that they didn't believe I really wanted to talk to them. By the end of the presentation, though, the youths were asking questions and sharing their experiences. We stayed briefly to talk to one group of the young prisoners. We explained what they would face upon their release and encouraged them, telling them how to create their own businesses rather than just hope for a job. They continued to yell out questions as they were being escorted out of the chapel, and they reached out to shake our hands. They had entered the room as prisoners, but they had left the room as hopeful young black youth, not unlike my own sons. I just wanted to touch on. She said that they explained what they would face upon their release and encouraged them, tell them how to create their own businesses. Well, when you go and you tell information to people like this in prison, you got to also remember that in order for them to retain most of that knowledge, they're going to have to write that down on paper. Most people do not have a photographic memory. And when you write something down on paper in prison that can put you in a position where you would never return or even free you, do know that the guards will fuck you up. They will come in there, take that shit away from you, beat you up, take your shit. This shit happened in every motherfucking prison I've been in, and I've been in like 17 of them, from Mexico to New York. You can check my record if you don't believe me. My name is on my page. It's public information. You can go and see for yourself. News about the session apparently spread quickly, and by the time I was ready to leave, the island staff, many of who had been at the prison for more than 15 years, told me they had never seen such a positive response from that population. I would love to believe that we had done something earth-shaking or brilliantly unique to engender such a favorable response from the young men. In reality, the only thing we had constantly done was respect them. That was apparently enough. Unsanitizing American history. Studying history in American schools, we learn about the excesses of the Roman Empire, the viciousness of Stalin's Soviet Union, and the brutality of the Nazis. We learn about the barbarity of the Mongols and the cruelty of the Huns. You can easily add to this the list the Japanese during World War II, the Viet Cong, and the Hutu of Rwanda. We have had Slobodan Milosevic's Serbia, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, the Taliban, Osama bin Laden, and ISIS, to name but a few. Certainly, all of those listed above are responsible for their fair share of atrocities. But missing from this list is one society that is responsible for some of the most gruesome crimes against humanity in history, the United Snakes of America. While the powers that be in America are happy to talk about others' crimes, they seem reluctant to confront their own. With respect to the genocide of the Native Americans and the enslavement and later oppression of those of African descent, the history we learn in this land has been sanitized. In many regards, this was the hardest chapter of the book to write. For weeks on end, my research took me to narratives, stories, and reports that knotted my stomach, moved me to rage, and brought me to tears. How do I make the real pain and suffering of our how do I make the real how do I make real the pain and suffering of our ancestors? How do I give their experiences appropriate recognition? How do I bring to people's awareness the vileness of those who perpetrated these crimes? In some ways, this can never be done because we have trouble confronting such pain and suffering. We really don't want to put ourselves in their place. For most of us, it's just too hard. Even many of the accounts written by those who lived through these times are strangely absent of emotion, as if no words could communicate their experience. Have you ever had a really severe migraine? Have you ever had a terrible case of the flu? Have you had to battle cancer? Have you ever been in a car accident or injured yourself so badly and the pain was so intense and persistent that all you wanted was medication to knock yourself out? In these moments, the pain and misery consumes you. It's all you can think about. It's all you can feel. It's all you know. Now imagine being in a constant state of hunger, pain, and thirst. When you can get past your physical state, you are greeted by feelings of fear, anger, grief, and hopelessness. Imagine giving up your dignity, your identity, will, and soul to relieve your seemingly endless suffering. What effects must such compromises have on human beings? It is no wonder that the transatlantic slave trade, slavery, and the times that followed are usually given such short shrift in the recounting of our history. This is hard stuff. For too many people say, of course the Middle Passage was bad. Of course slavery was bad. Of course Jim Crow and lynching were bad, as well as mass incarceration. Now let's move on. Rarely are people willing to look at what bad really was. In the pages that follow, I hope to make real some of the experiences of our ancestors. It is important in this chapter that you try to feel what they might have gone through. We need to do this in order to learn and appreciate our history. We need to do this in order to get a stronger sense of the forces that have shaped our community. Finally, we need to do this so we can understand the strength of our people in which they had in order to survive and at the times even thrive in some of the harshest conditions. Strength that has been passed down to us. The Mafa. Maafa. If I pronounce it wrong, tell me, teach me. Don't belittle me. If I'm wrong, point it out, teach me. I'm more than humble enough to admit when I'm wrong and learn, because I'm always willing to learn, right? The transatlantic slave trade, referred to as the Middle Passage, marks a period of human trauma rarely equaled. The Middle Passage describes one leg of the triangular route of trade that brought captured African men, women, and children to the Americas and enslaved them. Millions were forced onto cargo ships bound for unknown lands that included Brazil, the West Indies, Europe, and the United States, among others. These people were loaded on the ships and crammed together with sometimes less than 18 inches between them. Here they would dwell for many weeks to several months in the bowels of the ship. They were deprived of any human comfort and shared in a collective misery. This disgusting place was where they slept, wept, ate, defecated, urinated, menstruated, vomited, gave birth, and died. It has been estimated that the millions of Africans who died en route exceeded the number of Jews killed in the Holocaust of the 1930s and 40s. Yet few of us are even aware that this part of African American history exists. They even created a $200 million building for the so-called Jews they claim to be the greatest Holocaust of the world, where only a claimed 6 million were killed or died, right? But there were 600 million Africans that were killed throughout the Middle Passage, not to mention how Jim Crow slavery, lynching, how Jim Crow lynching and mass incarceration, and these police out here are killing us still. Yeah, few of us are even aware of this. Okay. The first enslaved Africans were captured and brought to Portugal in 1444. See, they always like to talk about the 1500s, the 1600s, you know what I'm saying? But as you see, the first Africans were captured and brought to Portugal in 1400. Not to mention, before any of this, there was an Arab slave trade that began and has killed an unknown amount of Africans, and it is still going on as we speak. The first slaves were brought to South Carolina by the Spanish in 1526, basically a little less than a century later. Although slavery has been a long part of human history, American chattel slavery represents a case of human trauma not comparable in scope, duration, and consequence with any other incidents in human enslavement. It is incomparable to any other instance of human enslavement. So fuck that Jew shit, because they didn't go through what we went through. No people endured the torture and the abuse and the ostracization that we face here in the United States of America. Yes, I said the United States of America. I got it from the brother Khalid Muhammad. I love his fervor, and I'm going to steal some of it. The fact that the delegation from the United States walked out of the United Nations World Conference against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, which took place in Durban, South Africa in 2001, a conference that declared American chattel slavery as a crime against humanity, served only to highlight America's refusal to acknowledge this period in her own past. In 2016, the United Nations sent a group of experts on people of African descent to the United States to meet with Black Americans in numerous cities, including Jackson, Mississippi, Baltimore, Maryland, New York City, Chicago, Illinois, and Washington, D.C. After a week of meetings to gather facts and information, the working group released its preliminary recommendations citing their serious concerns about the human rights issues of Africans in America or African Americans. They suggested that the United States establish a National Human Rights Commission and officially acknowledge that the transatlantic slave trade was a crime against humanity. The UN Working Group identified the intentional targeted attacks of people of African descent in America since their arrival and leading up to present times as a crisis that needs to be remedied immediately. Immediately. Let all of the prisoners go. Anyone that is of African descent that's in prison, let them go. Period. We'll deal with it when they get out, right? The colonial history, the legacy of enslavement, racial subordination and segregation, racial terrorism, and racial inequality in the United States remains a serious challenge as there has been no real commitment to reparations and to truth and reconciliation for people of African descent. Contemporary police killings and the trauma it creates are reminiscent of the racial terror lynchings in the past. Impunity for state violence has resulted in the current human rights crisis and must be addressed as a matter of urgency. In spite of evidence from both national and international agencies and even personal accounts and testimonials from those who have experienced the traumas firsthand, there is still reluctance to acknowledge or redress the injuries to African Americans. This transatlantic exploitation is now being referred to as the Black Holocaust or the MAFA, M-A-A-F-A, which in Swahili means disaster, calamity, or catastrophe. Until recently, American historians have been unwilling to confront the realities of this great suffering, as evidenced by the usual absence of these events from our public school curricula and textbooks. Though a full accounting of the story of slavery and the slave trade has yet to make its way into our schools and our social consciousness, in the last few decades, they have become hot topics of research in the halls of academia. The subject of how many African Americans were transported to the Americas along the Middle Passage has been a contentious issue for many scholars. In his 1969 study, The Atlantic Slave Trade, a Census, Philip Curtin placed the number of Blacks transported across the ocean at 8 million. Most studies since then have increased this estimate. For example, Hugh Thomas's 1997 work, The Slave Trade, The Story of the Atlantic Slave Trade, 1440 to 1870, puts the number of Africans that arrived in the Americas at approximately 11 million. More recent studies that have used documented evidence such as a manifest as their basis have placed their estimates between 10 and 15 million. Many Africans died during the Maafa. How many? Most scholars agree that nearly as many Africans died across the Middle Passage as reached the end of the voyage. If this is true, then it's likely that between 10 and 15 million died on the voyage. And this does not account for the millions of Africans estimated to have died fighting against their will be captors who never made it to the slave ships. The actual number of those who died in Africa and en route to the Americas will never be known. However, the fact that millions perished is not difficult to conceive given the horrific and vile conditions aboard the slave ships. In some cases, when there was an acute outbreak of disease like smallpox or dysentery, ships were abandoned at sea with their human cargo chained helplessly below, destined to suffer a slow, merciless death. Those who fought against their captors were murdered. Others took their own lives rather than being resigned to a life of brutality and torture. And the suffering certainly didn't end for those who survived the journey. Life in bondage. Let's be clear. Bondage is contrary to self-determination and free will, and thus against humanity. Therefore, bondage in any form is abusive. When we discuss living enslaved, we are discussing only degrees of abuse. I have actually heard people attempt to justify slavery by arguing that many of those enslaved didn't have it so bad. They claim some were even treated extremely well and were better off than other people who were destitute and left to their own devices. All I can say is that these people are the worst of hypocrites, for who among them would willingly give up their freedom under any condition? Once again, let me be perfectly clear about this. Slavery, by its very nature, is abusive and abhorrent to the human spirit. It was no accident that the state of New Hampshire adopted the motto, live free or die. Freedom means that much to us all. It is detestable that constitutions were written and laws were enacted to develop and maintain the institution of slavery. The enslaved had not even the simplest of human rights. They were chattel, defined as a movable item of personal property. And as chattel, slave owners were free to do with them as they pleased. As noted above, slave masters' rights to abuse those in their charge were codified with laws such as Virginia's Casual Killing Act of 1705 and its Unlawful Assembly Act of 1680, which, among other things, made it legal to kill a slave who raises a hand against any Christian. Come on, man. Being whipped until skin peeled off, worked to exhaustion day after day, beaten, deprived of food, water, raped repeatedly, men, women, and children. Considered less than livestock and treated worse. That was the life of a slave. But most slaves weren't whipped, raped, or tortured daily. Most days were relatively uneventful. I've heard people argue. Yes, I'm sure that was often the case. So tell me, how many times a person must be brutalized in order to be traumatized? It only takes one time. What is the number of rapes an average woman must endure before we can assume that she has been affected? And so far, we have only considered physical assaults. Every day of a slave's life was an assault on their dignity, their humanity, and their soul. The simple act of calling another man master is degrading and demeaning. How much more so saying it to someone for whom you only have hatred and loathing? I'm counting how many pages. Okay. This is 94, we're on 60. So I'm knowing this is like 18 more pages. So I'm going to just read results of overseer beating and rape, and I'm going to stop there. But I'll begin again later on at barbarism in the name of science. So this will be the last piece of the chapter that I'll read until I get back on. Rather than cursorily addressing the many forms of brutality enslaved Africans experience, I decided I would write more in depth about two aspects of the barbaric treatment, rape and medical experimentation. I searched for a way to approach writing this section that flowed and made sense. I struggled to find an opening statement, an anecdote, or quotation. I decided to start off by sharing the frequency in which white slave masters exercised their sexual privileges on young girls, girls who rarely reached their early teens without having been sexually abused, and to talk about the laws that stated no white could ever rape a slave woman. The regulations of laws to the white race on the subject of sexual intercourse do not and cannot, for obvious reasons, apply to slaves. Their intercourse is promiscuous, so black women were perceived to be animal-like. The early English had believed that black women copulated with chimpanzees, or what were thought to be orangutans. It was already within the law to beat, torture, sell, and accidentally kill slaves, so rape, of course, was a natural fit. Dorothy Roberts, in Killing the Black Body, writes, the fact that white men could profit from raping their female slaves does not mean that their motive was economic. The rape of slave women by their masters was primarily a weapon of terror that reinforced whites' domination over their human property. Rape was an act of physical violence designed to stifle black women's will to resist and to remind them of their servile status. What must have it been like? What must it have been like? Imagine that there is a mother with young children, among them a daughter about 10 years old or so. Like any good mother, she will want to protect her children from harm. Because she is enslaved, her children are also slaves, and she must come to grips with the fact that she is incapable of defending them against assaults from masters and overseers. This mother knows there will be a day when white men will demand to have access to her daughter, and that these men or boys will use her fragile young body to satisfy their sexual cravings. That day may mark the initiation into manhood for the slave master's son, or perhaps that day she will be offered as an evening gift for a white male visitor. The mother, no doubt, anguishes over this fact, but still she hopes to lessen the tragic event by at least acquainting her innocent child with the particulars of being raped. She tries to help her little girl understand what will happen and why it is happening at all. She endeavors to explain how it will feel, how her vagina will tear, burn, and bleed. She attempts to tell her how best to prepare and survive the ordeal, tells her to lie still, not to resist, and to try to bear the pain. But there are limits to what she can tell her child to better prepare her. She cannot tell her how often they will come, how long it will last, or how many there will be. This mother cannot protect her, nor can the father who looks on powerless, defeated, and emasculated. The business of raping enslaved women and girls may conjure up pictures of cruel and lascivious rednecks and cross-burning racists fully draped in Klansman garb. The truth is that those who participated in these rapacious acts were most often men and women of stature and prominence, like the famous Dr. James Marion Sims, the founder of modern gynecology. I'm going to stop right here. I hope your today is great and your tomorrow is greater. www.kmtflix.com, Kemetflix.com, one of the largest libraries of conscious information if you're trying to elevate. I suggest you go there, and the subscription is only $5. It doesn't matter what country you're from, Kenya, Nigeria, Cameroon, anywhere. You could be in the Dominican Republic, you could be in Europe, anywhere in North America, anywhere in the world. You got access to it. I strongly urge you to check it out. You won't be disappointed. Again, may your day be great and your tomorrow be greater. Check you out later on. Peace.